a, recreational drug, Molly, ecstasy, people like to use it to party. What most people don't know was MDMA was actually first created as a pharmaceutical tool to be used by psychiatrists. Pharmacologically speaking, it enhances the concentration of at least 3 neurotransmitters in your brain. It's serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline.
New data point, times have changed, and it's time to put a new frame around that.
It increases your trust, your empathy, your openness, and your social connection.
Okay, so I'm so excited to be chatting. I've been following you for a while. We've had several conversations. Obviously started hearing about you when you're in the cannabis space, and now you've moved on to that. And I think you've kind of found your area, and you're going to go into this and tell the audience in much more detail. Very interested in getting into MDMA. But before we do, I know we're going to get into ketamine. But before we do that, in your own words, and in your own way of introducing yourself to this growing little community that we have here, how would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about who you are and what your interests are?
Thanks, Chad. Thank you so much for having me. I've also been following your work for a long time, and it's really cool to see this space developing. So my name is Dilara Bahceci. I am a neuropharmacologist. I have a PhD for my research on medical cannabis for childhood epilepsy. And I've been working both in academia and the private sector developing psychoactive drugs for mostly mental disorders. And these are drugs like ketamine, MDMA, and psychedelics, which have been designated as breakthrough therapies for these conditions because they're showing so much promise. So I'm really passionate about developing effective and accessible treatments for mental health. And I also specialize in science communications. So I work as head of communications for Silo, which is a biotech company developing novel treatments for depression. And I am a research fellow at the George Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization that really centers around this health equity piece about making sure we develop effective and accessible treatments.
Amazing. And don't be downplaying it. We've got links below as well, because who you work in, what you're doing at the moment, there's no doubt you're putting Australia on the map. It's very evident of the noise that is continuously surrounding what you and the company are doing, which is amazing. So yeah, it's great to have you on. One of the things that there was a tweet that you did, and I'm going to have it'll be on the screen by now for the audience. But one of the things which I think is super important was that you said there was some lessons to learn from cannabis. So there were some lessons to learn from cannabis in going into psychedelics. What would you like? How would you like to expand on that? And what do you kind of see as some of those lessons which are important, which we could have learned and we can learn from cannabis to ensure that we get this right, particularly as Australians living and being based overseas, both of us at the moment for different reasons. But Australia has a lot of responsibility at the moment. Many eyes will be on us for what is now possible, what patients are now accessing. And yeah, very keen to see what do you see as some of those key lessons?
So as some background, Australia was the first country to recognize psilocybin, which is an active component of magic mushrooms, and MDMA, which is more commonly known as sort of ecstasy or Molly. These are drugs as medicines for depression and PTSD specifically. So Australia is the first country in the world to create an access program. It's not free use, it's like a restricted program, but patients can access these treatments. So Australia is leading the charge in this respect. And I personally am just so lucky to be working with so many amazing people who are really passionate about, patient-centered care and making sure these treatments become accessible. Speaking of the lessons to learn, one of the major lessons I learned from my time in medical cannabis was that the efficacy of a treatment isn't always enough to make sure the treatment gets sort of taken up and used by doctors. So we saw this with CBD, which is the main component of medical cannabis for childhood epilepsy. And with medical cannabis being legalized in Australia in 2016, I think it was 2 or 4 years later, it was only 2% of patients were actually accessing medical cannabis through the legal pathways. So there is this massive gap between proving that a medicine is effective in clinical trials and then it becoming actually accessible to the patient. And that's sort of where my passion in science communication developed, because it made me understand that there is a gap there that needs to be closed and bridged, especially with these substances that have so much history and stigma around them. Like, I remember growing up and there were the ads about someone holding an egg and saying, you know, this is your brain. And then they would crack it into the frying pan and say, this is your brain on drugs.
Yep.
These days, I get ads for medical cannabis, for ketamine treatments, all of that on Instagram, Facebook. And, you know, I'm not that old. So in my lifetime, we've had this massive shift in understanding. So there's a lot of work to be done in, I think for me, it's really evidence-based communications about these things. Because I don't think drugs are good or bad. I think drugs are tools, and they, you know, how we use them determines their benefit and harm.
Yep.
So there are so many lessons to learn from the cannabis industry or the cannabis space.
Yes.
And one of the things I really liked as well was that was unprecedented. You know, we were able to create pathways to make medical cannabis accessible to patients. And a lot of that was driven by patient advocacy. Like Lucy Haslam did such an amazing job driving that force. So yeah, I'm really excited to see psychedelics follow through and do better.
Exactly. And access is key. And I imagine, you know, you wear many hats, but with the hat of the scientist on at the moment, I would imagine one of the things which has continuously pulled you in the direction of where you are now positioned with psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, etc., is the data behind it and the strength of that data, which then opens up access pathways. And I think when we have a look at access, then stigma, and we're going to get to some of those ads as well a little bit later, we then are in a situation where we started to see increasing data. You know, and we're going to get to the results of that phase 3 with MDMA. But something like ketamine, again, which has been hasn't been integrated in, it has been in mainstream medicine for a long period of time and seen and known to be very safe, right? Known to be extremely safe and known to be extremely cost effective as well. But now we're in a situation where it wasn't one of the first compounds or medicines that was provided to be accessible for individuals. But this year, I just started hearing people in Australia say, I started taking ketamine treatment. And I was like, you know, obviously in America with the links to it to the US, and I see how much access there is there, but I also see huge challenges in terms of ketamine access at home for some providers, not all, of course. But that idea of access is something that you're making the rounds with a few publications at the moment. And yeah, I think it would be good to showcase some of your brilliant work.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, that's actually one of the big things I'm working on at the George Institute. And ketamine is a really interesting case study. And again, I think almost like a warning sign for psychedelics, because it is the first of its kind of these treatments. It was sort of the first fast-acting antidepressant to be developed. Its first antidepressant effects were noticed in the year 2000. So ketamine itself was developed as a anesthetic drug in the 50s. So it's been around for a long time. It's been used in millions of patients. It's relatively safe. We know that. So when its antidepressant effects were first noticed, it was in a sticky situation where, because ketamine is a generic medication, it can't be patented. And then because it can't be patented, there's no incentive for anybody to develop it as an antidepressant. So currently it's being used off-label. But if it's not approved for an indication, it can't go under PBS in Australia, the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, and it can't be reimbursed. So people have to pay for it out of pocket. And ketamine itself is a very cheap drug. It's about $5 to $20 per dose. But ketamine needs to be administered in a clinic under supervision. And there's a 2-hour monitoring period. And the cost for that administration is about $200 to $300 per dose. And ketamine isn't a treatment you take just once. You know, there will be regular dosing. And that makes it, you know, prohibited for most people to access this treatment. What's really frustrating is it's a really effective treatment. But because it's not approved, there's no pathways to have any of those costs reimbursed. So the work we're trying to do is, you know, either we require systemic change where we need to create incentives so these drugs can be repurposed, and there's so much benefit. Like, most of the work has already been done. You're starting at, sort of 80% of the race. It's just completing that final hurdle, but that final hurdle costs, it does have significant costs. So yeah, a lot of our work is trying to persuade the government to kind of create some new pathways to make these treatments accessible. Because what's happened with ketamine is a proprietary version was developed, which is Spravato. It's the nasal spray version of ketamine. That got approved for depression in 2019, 2020, which is amazing on paper. There is this ketamine treatment that's effective, and it's been approved for depression.
And doing some really good revenue at the moment, right? Yeah.
It's going to crack the 1 million mark potentially by the end of the year, they think. So as I say, racemic ketamine, generic ketamine is $5 to $20 a dose. Spravato is about $500 to $900 per dose. And because of that cost, the committees that determine whether a drug ends up on the reimbursement scheme think it's too expensive. It's not cost effective. So we've now ended up in a situation where, both these drugs are effective, but neither are accessible.
Yes.
And if that money that went into developing Spravato initially went into developing ketamine, then we would have a really cost-effective treatment that most people could access. So this is a situation that's going to continue happening unless systemic change comes into place. And we're going to see it happening with psilocybin, which is a natural product. It can't be patented, and MDMA. So most people know MDMA as a, recreational drug. Molly, ecstasy, people like to use it to party. What most people don't know was MDMA was actually first created as a pharmaceutical tool to be used by psychiatrists in a therapeutic use. And this was, back in the 50s and 60s. So that is also off patent. So we're going to see the same situation occurring with this new wave of really effective or potentially effective psychiatric treatments coming through.
So much to dive into, but I am mindful of time, so I'd love to do a little bit more at another time, because I'd love to look at ketamine. It's a long-standing treatment, as you mentioned. So people aren't having one, they're having multiple sessions, and it can be over a significant amount of time. I think there was a patient reported in one of your publications for The Guardian that was taking it for at least over a year. Then you got such variability in dosing ranges, which then is another factor that we could dive into. Before we kind of close on ketamine and then go down that lovely segue that you brought us to with MDMA, what would be a potential pathway? So what you're saying there is that you're lobbying, and please, again, I'm not trying to pry, but if there is any any information that you can provide to the public around what sort of strategy is presented to government as a potential pathway for this, is there anything that you can speak to there?
So the way I see it, I think there's two sort of scenarios. We either need to persuade someone to fund the approval of ketamine for depression, and this can be, a pharmaceutical company, or it can be philanthropy-backed or government-backed. Like, the government is doing an amazing job of trying to fund these studies, and Australia actually just this year published the largest study of generic ketamine for depression. It was led by Colleen Liu from the Black Dog Institute and UNSW. And that was mostly funded by government funding, but it's not enough. So we need to kind of pull in more funding to get that approved, so then it can go down the pathway. The TGA does recognize the benefits, and they have put out a consultation to try and reduce the barriers. So they are looking at this, they're interested. Everyone thinks it's a good idea. It's just trying to figure out how to do it. Or the other way is to have something reimbursed that isn't approved, but is being, widely used off-label, and it is, recommended. At the moment, ketamine is recommended by the College of Psychiatrists. So, and that would be sort of an unprecedented path. But I know Australia is actually really good at sort of taking a leap forward and doing things that no one else has done before. So I'm feeling really hopeful about this space.
While we're on that idea of hopefulness, there's an interesting tweet again that I saw last week, and I don't want to butcher it, but it was along the lines of doing retreats down in South America. You were there immersed in the jungle, and you're with waterfalls and in nature. And when I receive ketamine in America, I'm in a car park. So if we're looking at the future of access for Australian patients at the moment, let's just focus on Australia. If you're putting on that hat to just think about how good could this be, and where does healthcare get to, and what does mental health treatment look like as it evolves? What does that look like? Because in some ways, people are going to be listening to this, and the concept of MDMA is going to be something that they did in a club, right? Or something that they did at a friend's house where they were actually probably doing informal counseling. Yeah. Or group,
Yeah.
but not actually understanding because there was so much stigma that was involved in it, same as ketamine. So what could be a future pathway that you think that access could look like for PTSD patients, for depression patients in the future? What would you love to see?
I would love to see sort of community clinics, community care. I think that is something everyone is seeking at the moment. We have somehow along the way lost community. You know, we're more connected than ever and somehow less connected than ever.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting with these, and we'll get into this, but with MDMA, it's not just the drug being given. Like, you don't just go to a pharmacist and they give it to you. It's MDMA assisted psychotherapy.
Yes.
And the idea is that the drug is enhancing or catalyzing the benefits of therapy. So in the clinical trials, these are being, the therapy is taking place in these really nice rooms. It's actually so interesting to be walking down a hallway, a hospital hallway, really clinical, fluorescent lighting, super clean. And then you open the door into a room and it's just like soft lighting. There's a couch, there's plants, there's like a water fountain, there's peaceful music. And they're trying to create this really comfortable space for you to enter and be able to process your emotions.
Yeah.
And I think that is what this psychedelic assisted therapy will look like. They'll have these really nice spaces. And, you know, in the ideal world, there's these clinics all over the place and they're accessible by lots of people. And we have group therapy and all of these other kinds of therapy to really capitalize on the benefits we can get from MDMA.
Yeah, love to see that. Maybe they do some of those AI generated like things you see on Instagram where it's like these beautiful cliffs and there's like a beautiful glass panes, water falling, and people were there having their treatment and receiving their medicine. Diving into MDMA. And I think, and I'm hoping that if people are still watching, thank you, subscribe, share, like. I think this is what we're trying to do, is provide credible information. And that's why we're having this conversation and got an expert in to kind of talk to this, because most of the audience at the moment probably has experiences with MDMA. But as I said, those experiences were probably in a backyard, at a pool, in a park, at a festival, in a club, right? And now it's looking at the repositioning of this. And the idea of repositioning and framing is super important for me. And I'm going to share a quick little story and then I'm going to come to you. I was talking to an individual yesterday in we've got a real world data study occurring at the moment for police officers with PTSD. And it's around the use of cannabis medicines. And one of the things that came up was for a police officer, and I don't want to go into too much details because obviously keep the confidentiality, but the whole idea of being in law enforcement and then for many years being out there and looking at cannabis and seeing cannabis in a way that I was a social worker in the past and would see it as risk, then seeing it as the solution can come with some guilt, Now, my invitation of that would be that there's a new data point, times have changed, and it's time to put a new frame around that. And I think many of us grew up thinking that if you take MDMA, you're going to lose your brain, right? You're going to be in a nursing home in the future with no spinal fluid. Yeah. And there was all misinformation that I think you'd be able to speak to that went everywhere. And it wasn't even based on MDMA, correct? Can you speak to that a little bit as a segue to then dive into the phase 3?
Sure can. So MDMA was demonized. It was made illegal in sort of the late 60s. And there were studies coming out that showed that MDMA is neurotoxic. And the studies that supported that argument, that they were using, one, very high doses, and two, it turned out it wasn't even MDMA, it was methamphetamine. It was causing neuronal loss. So yeah, they butchered that story. Looking at the clinical use, looking at the data, if you're using MDMA in the clinical setting and you're using it under supervision and you know what you're getting, there are no long-term harms that have been reported. I will say that there are absolutely risks and harms to using MDMA, and it seems like from the general data that we have, which is mostly, used in the recreational space, the more you use it and the more frequently you use it, the more likely you are of causing damage. So it's kind of one of those things where less is more. But in the clinical setting, it seems to be, relatively safe, and there are no lasting harms.
Okay. Why is it so effective? I think you touched on it before, and some of us with experience, or the audience that have lived through their 20s or teens and been able to have conversations which allow them to get to places. What's actually going on, and what occurs? Why is this effective? And how important is the data at the moment to support MDMA?
Yeah, so I'll just go into again how it's being used in a clinical setting. So as I said, it's being used with therapy, and there's 3 phases. There's the preparation phase, that's before receiving any drug. You're meeting with your therapist, you're setting your intentions, they're preparing you for something. And then you've got the treatment, which involves a dosing session. That's where you take the MDMA, it's under supervision, you're with 2 therapists. In that, in that really nice room.
Yeah.
It lasts it's most of the day, it can be like 4 to 8 hours. So it's quite an intensive experience. And then after that, you have 3 integration sessions, and that's sort of where most of the work is happening.
Gotcha.
So all of the revelations you've had in that dosing session, you're trying to make sense of it. You're trying to integrate the learnings into your life, because,
Sure.
sidetrack a bit. The biggest lie we've ever been told with like antidepressants, medications, is you can take a drug every day, change nothing else about your life, and get better. What we really need to do is support behavioral change, to put in the changes to ensure your life gets to where you want to be. For some people, that's changing a job, it's quitting bad addictions, it's becoming, taking up healthy habits, calling your mom, all of these things. So the psychedelics, MDMA and psilocybin, are helping facilitate these changes. So with MDMA-assisted therapy, there are 3 dosing sessions a month apart. So you take the MDMA, you have your therapy, then you take MDMA, you have therapy, and then you take the MDMA and have therapy. So this whole treatment, it's spanning, about at least 4 months, sometimes a bit longer. So it's quite an intensive session. I think that's why it's so effective, is it's not just taking a drug, but what the drug is doing. So MDMA, pharmacologically speaking, it enhances the concentration of at least 3 neurotransmitters in your brain. It's serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline, science speak. But what it's making you feel is it reduces your fear response, it increases your trust, your empathy, your openness, and your social connection. So humans are really good at protecting themselves, and part of that is sometimes we repress a lot, and you definitely see this in people with PTSD. So after a traumatic incident occurs, it is normal for everybody to have PTSD symptoms. That is absolutely a normal response to trauma. Most people recover from that. They see that as something that has happened in the past, and they're able to move on. People with PTSD, their brains just are working in a different way, where they're not able to move on. They're kind of stuck in that traumatic phase. They're having the nightmares, they're having, all of the symptoms, they're reliving it. What the MDMA is allowing them to do is it puts them in a safe enough space where they can finally bring up those traumatic experiences, process them, deal with them, and then, hopefully move on. And this is what we're seeing in the clinical trials. So MDMA just finished its 2nd phase 3 trial. And that is the final phase of clinical development before a drug goes through to approval. In this study, I think it was 104 participants were involved, and it was about 50-50, maybe 51 to 53. Half the group got MDMA plus therapy. The other half got placebo, so inactive, just taking like a sugar pill plus therapy. So they still got the therapy, but they didn't get the enhanced therapy. The MDMA group, majority of the participants saw a clinically meaningful reduction in their symptoms, and I think it was almost 80% didn't have a diagnosis of PTSD by the end of it. And these are people with moderate to severe PTSD. I think the average for the whole sample, they had been living with they've been living with PTSD on average for 16 years. So it's not like it had just happened. These are the more treatment resistant, difficult to treat conditions. So
and 80%.
I'll have to double check.
I think you're right.
Notes.
Yeah. But it's
was
significant. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, totally. It was 71%. So 87% of people saw a reduction in their symptoms, and 71% lost their diagnosis of PTSD.
And while this is significant, spell this out. Before MDMA was available, before this trial, what did treatment options look like for an individual with PTSD? Now, to kind of come in, 71%, so 7 out of 10, yeah, are now not having a diagnosis of PTSD after 16 years. Yeah. Before this, long-standing trauma, substance misuse, family breakdown, unemployment, likelihood of suicide, like all this is that's in some ways what comes with not receiving the treatment. And so now we're seeing not only maintenance, but no diagnosis. Like mind-blowing, correct?
It's remarkable. And it'll be, if this gets approved, so the trials have finished, and now the group developing it, MAPS, they're putting in their dossier to the FDA to gain approval. And if it gets approved, this will be the first new treatment for PTSD to be developed in over 2 decades. In over 20 years. So the mainstay treatment for PTSD before this, it's that exposure therapy. It's really about processing that trauma. There are some amazing treatments coming through, but again, it's about that accessibility issue. And for a lot of people, it's about going through with a therapy. Like, it's asking someone to trust a therapist and relive the most traumatic thing that has ever happened to them. So it's so challenging. And as you said, PTSD, it does come with all of these comorbidities. Like, most people have depression, substance use disorder. It's impacting their lives. I think, what is the statistic? It's about 1 to 2% of Australians will deal with PTSD every year. And it's about 12%. So 1 in 8 Australians will deal with PTSD in their whole lifetime.
Yep. And if MAPS is successful and the FDA approves, what does that mean for patients in the UK? What does that mean for patients in Australia? What does that mean for patients New Zealand, Brazil, rest of the world, etc.? Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah. So seeking approval in the US through the FDA is the first logical step, because they're the biggest market, and they kind of persuade everyone else, because they are quite rigorous in the way they assess, the benefits and harms of the drug. If it gets approved in the US, it doesn't automatically get approved in other jurisdictions. Each country, other than the European, the EMA that covers all of Europe, MAPS will need to put in an application for each of these jurisdictions. So, we're working at the George Institute, my work, we're communicating with MAPS, trying to persuade them and assist them to put in an application in Australia as soon as possible, because they just have to one by one go through all of these jurisdictions. And once you've done the first one, it is a lot easier. Like, a lot of it should be copy paste, but it is still a lot of work. There is still a lot of cost there. But if it gets approved in the FDA, like, it will eventually get approved in Australia. It's just about how quickly we can make that happen.
Yeah. How do you see adoption of MDMA as a treatment for individuals? So first and foremost, it's PTSD. Do you then see it expanding out to potentially depression as well? Are there indicators of that, or am I fishing too much?
Most of the evidence is for PTSD. Almost all of it is for PTSD. Psilocybin from magic mushroom, that is the psychedelic being developed for depression, and that's about to enter phase 3 trials. MDMA, realistically does have other applications. Like, initially it was being used for couples therapy, which for the people who have used MDMA, that would make a lot of sense to them. It increases empathy, connection, all of those. It allows you to see situations from someone else's perspective. So I know there's I work with Paul Ignaitsky from Monash University, and that's something he's really passionate about as well, is running a clinical trial with MDMA for couples therapy because there's so much benefit there. And,
Yeah.
you know, a disruptive family unit, it is one of those things that kind of carries on. So if you can stop that intergenerational transfer of trauma, that can have amazing flow-on effects.
Yeah.
But I can't, that trying to find funding for those kinds of studies, it's going to be a bit challenging because I feel like it's so far ahead in the future. You know, we're only just catching up to treating individuals where, you know, I think mental illness, it's not an individual disease, it's sort of more of a society disease.
What do you say with your area of expertise in communication? What is important? What is an important message to give out in terms of timing? So what I mean by that is that we could be in a situation where we haven't seen movement in 20 years, as you said, and now we're on the cusp, right, of, as you say, psilocybin's going through a phase 3. We've seen that Rick Doblin from MAPS just announced that ibogaine is a very interesting compound, and we've seen that really effective with PTSD patients as well. We continuously see this priming from some of the data that's come through, and then we see how restrictive some of the pricing can be in a country like Australia. In terms of the importance of communication, individuals were able to see at the start of the year, oh my gosh, Australia, first country in the world, this is amazing, and really primed individuals, and people kind of want it instantaneously. Whereas science doesn't work that way, right? So we need to go through process, and then it's regulation, and it's being able to demonstrate efficacy and safety at scale, and the significance of these compounds coming in to change a mental health landscape. What does the individual do that's listening to this and probably has had some struggles, or knows someone close to them that has had struggles? They're desperate in terms of communication. I'm not trying to put you under the pump here too much, but what is some messaging? What are some words that can go out to some of these individuals at the moment?
It's a really tricky
yes
situation.
Sorry to put you under the spotlight.
I absolutely feel for those patients. Like, I myself am a mental health patient, and that's why I got interested in this space as well, because it opened up a whole new avenue of hope. You know, you're less likely to reach the end of the line when there's a whole new landscape of treatments coming on board, and everyone wants them right now. But the caution there is recreational use or self-medication is very, very, very different to how it's being used clinically with these highly trained therapists. I personally would advise against it, even though it sounds very enticing. I think what we can do is keep making a lot of noise about this and keep applying pressure to our government bodies to help fund the research that's needed to help make these things accessible. Because I think big picture, it's beneficial for everyone. For the government, it's going to be more, there's a potential for it to be more cost effective. If it's an effective treatment that's accessible, that's going to improve the mental health of, all Australians. And, medical cannabis taught us a lesson that the patient voice is so important. And like, one of my favorite sayings is, like, if you're annoying enough, people kind of will just fight, like, they will eventually listen to you. So I think it's like the really important message here is, like, this is the most promising treatment to have been developed in psychiatry, in decades. And it already has done wonders for the space. There's more funding coming in, there's more people interested in this area, but it is really, we're at those first few steps. We still need so much more research to be done. And what we really need to do is support that research. And Australia is one of the best places for this to be happening. We have, a critical mass. We have some of the best mental health researchers in this space.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess what you're saying there is to be annoying, advocate for these changes in the right ways. There's many organizations that people can be part of and follow. And I know you've got your newsletter that goes out, which, you should give a plug after this. But then it's also participation in clinical trials, right? So if this is something for you or for a loved one, be part of the research and be part of that change however you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, clinical trials, there is a clinical trial taking place at Monash University with Paul Luknitsky. I think it's specifically for first responders and military personnel. But if you fit that brief, Google just Monash PTSD study or Monash MDMA study, and you'll find it.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Anything else as we close up? Anything that, as head of communication, that you want to give people a little teaser about what they may expect? It is a lot of the world looks towards what you all are doing. I'm just curious, is there, and did you want to share a little bit about the company, or is there any share about your plans, or what would you like to say as head of comms?
So as head of comms for Silo, Silo is doing something really interesting at the moment. Is they're trying to fill that gap. They're developing novel therapeutics based on psychedelics that have been developed in nature. They're going down the traditional pharmaceutical route, but the idea is we're developing something that can be accessible to more patients. Because as good as psychedelic assisted therapy is, until we get that therapy piece right, most people aren't going to be able to access that. So there is so much room for, a better antidepressant to be developed in that time. And that's what Silo is working on. And if you're interested in this space, I create a newsletter each month that kind of summarizes all of the research that is taking place in the psychedelic space, in the serotonin, mental health space. And I do this cute science in 60 seconds section where I'll take a topic that I'm hearing a lot of people discussing and break it down and explain it. Like last month, we looked at the cardiac side effects of microdosing, because a lot of people don't know that psilocybin actually hits a target, a receptor in your heart. And if you use it long term, it might have cardiac toxicity. So there is so much education to happen in this space. So if you're interested, subscribe to my newsletter or check it out. You can find it by Googling Silo and newsletter. Silo spelled Psylo.
Great. Fantastic. I know you're going back to Australia. Wish you the best for that short amount of time. And yeah, anything else that you would like to close with? I know this has been, for me, I could have dived into so much more. I know there's some information that just come out recently around microdosing psilocybin. Historically, the evidence has been that there is no evidence, and I'm starting to see a little bit of a change. I know Imperial's just starting some new studies. So there's so much that we would love to unpack, but we are respectful of your time. Thank you so much for coming in. While I've just given you a few more minutes to think, is there anyone else you want to shout out? Any colleagues that you want to kind of highlight their work, or anything that you want to say to close up today?
Yeah, I just want to really thank my supervisor, Anthony Rogers from the George Institute, for really leading a lot of this work in Australia, Colleen Liu from Black Dog Institute, Paul Ignatsky from Monash, and John Brett from the UNSW St. Vincent's area, and Josh Isman and Sam Bannister from Silo for pioneering a lot of this work. I think, as you said, there is so much happening right now. As a pharmacologist myself, I've never been more excited to be working, in drugs and in mental health, because we have just opened a whole new world to explore. So it's going to, the future is bright again, I think, for me and for a lot of people. And I really want to give a shout out to you, Chad, for giving me this space to help spread some evidence-based communication on this topic. And there are lots of topics to discuss. So if you want to have me back another time to dive in, I'd love to come back.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.